So, without further ado, I will start by presenting Felicia Jing, who will give the first talk of the session. She is a political theory PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University. Since 2022, she has also held a scholar in residence position at the Thomas J. Watson Research Center at IBM. And seated within an institution whose history is coextensive with the history of modern data processing, her work describes computational systems from the point of view of capital and the state as technologies of planning. Meanwhile, she's working on her first book project, AI and Revolutionary Desire, which draws on Marxist traditions to stage them simultaneously as sites of social, political, and class antagonism. And her talk is titled The Concept of an Algorithm, New Robinsonades in Computer Science, and I would leave the floor to Felicia. Thank you.
Do I press this? It's on? Okay. Hi. So, yes, thank you so much for the introduction. There is one revision for the introduction because I have been laid off from IBM. They fired 300 researchers who were working on social science research. I was there for 3 years, working basically in the ethics department, and we were essentially an in-house superego, so obviously that really had to go. But today, I'm going to talk a bit about some work that comes out of my encounter with the mentality of the engineer, the computer scientist, from the last 3 years. And I'm going to tell basically a history of the formation of the concept of an algorithm. And this is work that's forthcoming in Political Concepts, a Critical Lexicon, the repoliticization of concepts. So you'll see from the title that I'll be arguing that the formation of this concept is also the formation of the ontological standpoint of computer science and an algorithm. Depends on what I'll argue is a new Robinsonade. And I'll start by briefly just saying what a Robinsonade is. So a Robinsonade refers to a literary device. It's very recognizable, the story of man stranded on a desert island. And its name comes from popular proto-novels of the 18th century, where the protagonist's name is Robinson Crusoe. And these stories are always followed by a montage of Crusoe's cunning and his wit, and we follow how this individual, alone and totally divorced from social relations, conquers his island. And we all know the story, even if we've never read the novel, because the figure of the castaway would be repeated across classical political economy, borrowing its literary aesthetic for the genre of the hypothesized origin story. And so we know this story from Rousseau, who would model the state of nature on Robinson Crusoe. More or less? No, more, please. Okay. It would also structure Adam Smith and his theorization of primitive barter economies, the eventual emergence of money, the origins of money. And Marx, of course, famously delivers a critique of these Robinsonade stories, where he writes that the individual isolated hunter and fisherman belongs to the unimaginative conceits of the 18th century Robinsonade, and what should be history's result appears as its point of departure. And I put this up because I want to highlight that at the end of this passage, Marx leaves us with this little reminder that the illusion of the Robinsonade has been common to each new epoch to this day. And it's from this reminder that we too must begin, because the Robinsonades of today are surely no longer the same fables of 18th century political economy. I'll argue that they are today found in computer science. So when the academic discipline, as an academic discipline, was formed around the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, it would be defined as the analysis of algorithms. So not information, and not the analysis of computers, but of algorithms. And an algorithm would be defined as a series of step-by-step instructions for solving a problem, a finite procedure, so simple that a computer could follow. And it's a bit of a vague definition, but the important thing is that every computer scientist will basically emphasize that algorithms do not just run on computers, that the concept is surrounded already by a bunch of images from everyday life. And here's one, quoted from an introductory text. One for you, one for me, one for you, one for me. You are in a schoolyard, the sun is shining. You are sharing a packet of sweets with your best friend. One for you, one for me. What you didn't realize back then was that sharing your sweets in this way was an enactment of an algorithm. And on this account, end quote, on this account, algorithms are not just lines of code executed by electronic computation, but they're recipes for baking a cake, librarian strategies for sorting a bookshelf, and these metaphors they signal a generalized algorithmic culture that makes it very easy to look for them everywhere, and anytime as well, as I'll say here. But they say much more about the way, they don't say much about the technology itself, but they say a lot about the way that our social fabric has internalized a certain political economic logic that we have identified as algorithms. So, one very popular strategy for legitimating the study of computer science is to locate algorithms like PageRank in a longer history. And we might say that it's a history preceded by Lovelace's algorithm, by even earlier an algorithm developed by Al-Khwarizmi, who we also etymologically link his name to the word algorithm, mistranslations from French to English. We also, every computer science textbook also will cite Euclid's algorithm, Greece 300 BCE. And even earlier, and this will be my focus, the Old Babylonian algorithms. This is ancient Mesopotamia. And my focus is on the Old Babylonian algorithms because it's here that we start getting accounts of prehistory. And prehistory is particularly a misty realm in Marx's language, where relations and artifacts become susceptible to a certain kind of enchantment. Old Babylonia would become a golden marker for the first algorithm at the founding of computer science. And how? It's actually through, funnily, these hobby histories. So in the 60s, several prominent engineers and programmers in their free time went into archives and rummaged through papyrus paper and stone tablets, and they found there the co-location of algorithms with civilization itself. And implicit in the story is that an algorithm is what brought mankind into its history. And that's a very prestigious legacy to locate yourself in. So these are the kinds of images that are brought up when we talk about the first algorithm. And it's in this prehistory that we find our Robinson Crusoe stories, so an island separated not only by space, but by time. These are stories comparable to the pre-social man of Hobbes, Smith's primitive producers, and I'm going to go through a few of them and read them symptomatically as an ideological expression. So, in one episode, Donald Knuth, one of these programmers, finds a large table of reciprocals at the Louvre, and in his account, a man named Inkabit, who had just completed this remarkable table, Knuth writes, displays the full force of his calculating ability. It is very laborious to work with such high precision numbers. Moreover, even after these numbers have been computed, the work is far from done. It is still necessary to sort them in order. And Knuth writes that this table is the earliest known example of a large file that has been sorted. Anyone who has tried to sort 700 cards by hand will attest. Yet, Inkabit must have done it, since there is no simple way to generate such a table in order. And for Knuth, this tablet evidences the work of an underlying algorithm beneath the stone. So the brutal handiwork that this table must have required becomes a sign that an algorithm is nearby, a clue into, quote, the early life of computer scientists. And it's in this ingenuity that Inkabit, quote, becomes the first man in history to solve a computational problem that takes longer than 1 second of time on a modern electronic computer. And this is such a typical arc of the Robinsonade. So algorithms signal our deliverance from manual labor, drudgery, of primitive modes of manual brute force calculation. An algorithm is a catalyst, not unlike the social contract or the invention of money. And it's in the setting, the discovery of the first algorithms, that we already point to the idea of successive stages or a progressive linear development towards our present. So take another example. Knuth digs up this tablet detailing the calculation of compound interest on 1 mana of silver and writes that this, quote, looks like a macro expansion. And to take another example, he finds this set of instructions and writes that this procedure reads surprisingly like a program for a stack machine, like the Burroughs B5 5000. Which is this room-sized computer from the late 70s. And he goes on, similarly, we find in other texts the instruction to, quote, keep this number in your head, a remarkable parallelism with today's notion that a computer stores numbers in its memory. And in all these moments, we see the function of the Robinson Crusoe story quite clearly. For in the course of discovering modern technology in ancient history, we also inevitably find modern society there as well. For we have to remember that in the conventional Robinsonade, the shipwrecked castaway is not just a man, he's also a bourgeois man. The problem is that 18th century prophets think that they have found the individual in nature already independent and autonomous. When in reality, these terms are conditioned on a specific historical development, the breaking of feudal bonds, the political conditions and juridical forms that condition the emergence of autonomous subjects. And yet, our ancient computer scientist is cast also not as a historical result, but history's point of departure. And the abstract sequential instructions of the 60s and 70s become completely indifferent to material substrate, hardware, people, things, affects that these instructions are meant to act on and through. So the algorithm becomes independent of programming languages and, quote, independent of the machines that execute the programs. And in this indifference, algorithms take on a mystified autonomy from their conditions. It requires a refusal of certain elements of the story itself. And these are, to take a look here, Knuth writes that one of the interesting things about Old Babylonian computer scientists is that they disregarded units. And so I read for this an obscene amount of archaeological research that suggests the contrary. So while there is a tradition of pure mathematics that would emerge around the first millennium, these tables referenced here do indeed deal with units. And importantly, they deal with grain, wheat, cows, plots of land. These were algorithms, but they're reproductive algorithms for cows, for herd size, algorithms for dividing and planning land distribution. And in some cases, and in some cases, laborers, labor hours measured in food rations, which tell us something about these social conditions. These algorithms were written ultimately by overseers and temple scribes, not the scholars that we might imagine mathematicians to be, but administrators in the Mesopotamian centralized state. And why write an ancient machine language for division, but to divide a granary among households? Which means that we find an algorithm entangled with storehouses of surplus wheat, centralized states that restricted access to these resources, a class of producers who were excluded from their social product, and whose consumption of that product needed to be regulated and managed by algorithms. And in telling this story, I'm not saying that they're not algorithms. It's kind of beyond like empirical veracity. I'm not saying that algorithms didn't exist before computers, but I'm telling a story about the fetishization of the concept. So to go back to the Robinson Crusoe story, an important chapter of the original story is that Robinson Crusoe one day encounters a stranger indigenous to his apparently uninhabited island, and he enslaves him. And he gives him a name, Friday, which he's named after the day of the week, and he gets him to work. And Friday plants and sows corn for Robinson Crusoe, and despite this, Crusoe congratulates himself on his own ingenuity and his own natural propensity towards survival. And Crusoe, in this moment, embodies instruction. Friday, on the other hand, execution, the separation of logic from material, of intellectual from manual labor. And I'd suggest then that just as the history of an algorithm is a Robinsonade, so too does the Robinson Crusoe story contain an algorithm. And this mentality, the vantage point of looking down on and directing the work of systems that with the right political institutions, the right arrangements of power, will look like an autonomous abstract recipe. So we get the naturalization of the automatic subject of capital, the fetishization of value valorizing itself, independent from human living labor, that is, from the troublesome physical components, or from the cheap labor of women operators, child labor employed previously as hand calculators. And we might also remember that the schoolyard algorithms and the kitchen algorithms and the recipes, it might precisely be at these moments that the concept is telling on itself a bit. And it's in this misrecognition of dependency that computer science achieves its self-narration as a cumulative historical technological development in a Platonic realm of mathematics. So, such that now what a good algorithm is, defined by Knuth, requires basically the study of the art of writing code, defined in terms of elegance, efficiency, processing time, sparseness, leanness, aesthetic qualities. And what I want to leave us with is just a gesture from within the content of the origin myth itself. So we might know that there's an essential link between algorithms and the notion of just distribution. This is also what's obscured in these stories. A form of metrological justice. So temple scribes, these ancient computer scientists, communed with the authority of the gods. And this Old Babylonian tradition of pure mathematics was inseparable from this job of currying divine favor for political rulers and for the arithmetic that underwrote administrative plans. A good algorithm that is more than just aesthetic and economic performance might be about a just algorithm, and an algorithm that is politicized from the beginning. And so this is my last slide. And cast this way, we might open another history, just like against basically the gradual curve of the Robinsonades history. My broader dissertation work argues that algorithms historically took on a more winding path through contested political terrain, a matter of battling political valences of terms like efficiency or productivity, of popular efforts to reevaluate or even transvaluate technical values as moral or political values. So something like a telling of a critical history of an algorithm without assuming, per Foucault, that words keep their meaning, that desires point in a single direction, and that ideas retain their logic. There might be an alternative genealogy of algorithms that begins also with the ontological starting point of computer science and understands algorithms as instead a political concept. Okay, I'm out of time, but that's kind of my larger project on planning, which I'd be happy to talk about more in the Q&A, but I'll leave it here for now. Thanks.
Okay, so next we have, as I was saying, Gabriele de Seta, after whose talk we'll have this Q&A session for both these first two talks. I will briefly present Gabriele, who is a researcher at the University of Bergen, where he leads the AlgoFolk project, that is algorithmic folklore, the mutual shaping of vernacular creativity and automation, funded by a Tron Mon Foundation starting grant. Gabriele holds a PhD from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University and was a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Ethnology, Accademia Sinica, and at the University of Bergen, where he was part of the DRC-funded project Machine Vision in Everyday Life. So his research work, more generally, is grounded on qualitative and ethnographic methods, focuses on digital media practices, socio-technical infrastructures, and vernacular creativity in the Chinese-speaking world. And the talk he's going to give is on algorithmic folklores. So I leave the floor to Gabriele.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for planning for my talk at this slot, because it's the perfect one, I feel. So I retitle my talk 40,000 Years of Algorithmic Folklore, and this is a project I lead at the University of Bergen. I'm not going to say much, but basically this short talk is a part of an essay I'm writing about the history of folklore and algorithms and their connection. And I want to situate it in the call for papers because I think that I'm working in this couple of decades in which algorithms have become culturally and socially relevant. So Alexandra Galloway defined algorithmic culture in 2006. William Riccio talked about the algorithmic turn in images in 2011. And after that, we had pretty much a social theory of algorithmic life emerging in books like Black Box Society, The Ordinal Society. But I think this is a recognition of something happening that happened in academia in the 2000s and 2010. And in the 2020s, what is happening is that there is another recognition that is about the emergence of a folklore about algorithms, which the previous talk was a great example of. Narratives, stories, ways of making sense of these entities. In 2019, Akinrenade Mukogosi mentioned this idea of algorithmic folklore for the first time in an article about how young kids use TikTok. Folklorist Guro Flinterud also defined algorithms as agents that take part in the production of folklore nowadays. And Minna Rukenstein has written a whole book about the feel of algorithms, how people make sense of algorithms through sorts of knowledge that are not scientific, but rather closer to folk theory and folk knowledge. So I'm very interested in this concept of algorithmic folklore, which is quite new. And I wanted to go back to the history, the connection between folklore and algorithms, because they seem two kind of opposite, diametrically opposite concepts. And I start even earlier than ancient Babylonian algorithms with the much longer history of calculation in human craft. And I want to emphasize the connection between calculation, computation, and prediction and modeling with crafts and with other forms of art and creativity. So these are the bones from the, or called the Bombo bones from South Africa, the San culture that used bones for many different types of tools and usages, but among them there are these notched bones that were, theoretically, reportedly, according to research, used for notational purposes, so to take note of intervals. And recent research on them says that they're not just made to produce decorative or ornamental objects, but they exhibit a will to accumulate marks through time for notational purposes. So we don't really know what they were tallying or marking, but it was a form of counting that is now inscribed in an artifact. And similar artifacts have been found from 40,000 years ago up to more closer times. This is from Abri Blanchard, I think. It's a reindeer bone in which, over time, marks have been inscribed to predict moon phases. So this is, again, an artifact likely reproduced through craft, folk craft, to generate or create an artifact of prediction. The quipu knots, knotted strings have been also extensively analyzed, much like ancient Babylonian algorithms, in search of algorithms embedded in the knots. There is research that explains how these knots on the strings were not only used to record and mark and transmit information, but also to encode meaningful clusters of isolable units that could express an arrangement of sums, so mathematical operations. And again, these are contested interpretations, and there is a lot of discussion around them, including the simulation of new quipus to try to make sense of the patterns. But this shows a long history and different attempts to find algorithms back in time, even before the term was invented. Shang Dynasty bones in China are also been found to, these are turtle shells that were burned until they cracked. And after they cracked, they were inscribed with symbols and numbers. And there have been found examples with numerical sequences that don't make sense or don't seem to make sense until they are analyzed as the results of mathematical calculation and algorithmic processing. This is a paper about how the authors claim to have found an algorithm inscribed in one of those oracle bones from China. I'll skip the part on Knuth, since we had a great presentation about it, but yes, the same goes for ancient Babylonian algorithms with cuneiform writing, and Knuth's idea that these represented precisely what we today define as an algorithm, so a step-by-step list of rules. But what I'm interested in is how algorithms are found not only in artifacts and craft, but also in stories. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the wheat and chessboard problem. This is the problem, the classical story that comes from India, but this circulated all over the world across cultures and translations. The story is that someone asks a king, presents a king with the game of chess, which was invented in India, and the king is so happy that he asks him to demand anything they want, and this person just says, well, I just want a grain of wheat on the first square of the board, and then I want it doubled every day. And this is obviously a mathematical process and problem and procedure that exemplifies or explains the process of exponential duplication. But the interesting part, there is a great article recent article by Alberto Bardi on this, is how this wheat and chessboard problem is connected both to the origin of a game and its history, but it's also an epistemic object. So the story itself is a structure that encodes cultural modes of mathematical thinking, ideas about the infinite, and it displays the intersection between abstraction and narrative. There isn't only craft and stories, but also rituals. Much discussed Anyachana ritual from Vedic ritual about building an effigy of a bird following instructions that replicate the Pythagoras theorem. And all this history, I think, ends or peaks at the translation of Al-Khwarizmi's work, so this Muslim mathematician and polymath from the 9th century, whose work was translated in Latin, and his name was adapted as algorithmi, and from this we get the algorithm term of today. And what really interests me is that on the one hand, as we've already heard, the idea of algorithm have existed way before the term algorithm was created, and algorithmic thinking and practices have existed and have been part of most human cultures we know of since the beginning of time, or at least of human time. The origin of the word algorithm itself is quite interesting because it comes from the name of a person, and the book that is called Dixit Algorithmi is pretty much algebra. And the retrospective discovery of algorithms in this name has been, its positionality is quite interesting, because this standard story about algorithmy, as Ted Streifus notes, was forged under colonial conditions, so British colonialism, and it displays a very interesting Orientalist desire to imagine that algorithm is Asia, which was around Persia and Turkey, is in a way Europe's protological past. So the flourishing period of Muslim mathematics from which algorithm emerged is reappropriated by Europe precisely to find an origin point of algorithms and algorithmic processes. So from this, which is a very compressed history of folklore and algorithms around them, I want to move to what I'm trying to look at as the ethnomathematics of algorithms themselves. So ethnomathematics is a field that studies mathematics as an ethnographic object, so how mathematical thinking and reasoning and doing are created in different human societies and cultures. And I want to do this because there's a lot of work on mathematical folklore. And the idea here is that what we think of as science or scientific disciplines are always grounded on other kinds of knowledge that are quite distant from what we define as empirical scientific knowledge. And there are classic stories in our cultural background, or what we like to think of as such. A clear example, which is also very close to a Robinsonade, is the Eureka moment. So Archimedes having a Eureka moment while taking a bath, or Galileo Galilei's experiment of throwing rocks from the Pisa Tower, or Newton's apple. These are versions of the same story. They're all been pretty much disproven of having actually happened as such. But they all embody a key narrative moment that is of a sudden discovery, a flash of genius of an individual scientist. But they also function as a pedagogical device because they embody a principle like buoyancy or acceleration or gravity. So this is mathematical folklore and has extended to famous people like Gauss. There is a story about Gauss solving algorithms or solving a very complex calculation in class that exists in at least 100 versions. There is a great article about collecting all the versions of this story. There are legends about John von Neumann solving complex calculations at cocktail parties that also contribute to myth building around him. Also a great article about the legends of John von Neumann. And today, this leads from mathematics to science, to computer science, to software, where folklorists have started to collect things like software folklore, so a folklore that develops around software programs, coding, programming. Software folklore is very similar to what I already discussed. They are legends, myths, stories, narratives that help describe how programmers engage with practices or coding languages. And these also include rituals and practices that encode informal knowledge before it's codified in more formal ways and help disseminate, for example, bug stories that people share on Hacker News. What I want to end with is how this is connecting to what people discuss today, because when we talk about algorithms, most of what we discuss today is artificial intelligence, which is based on machine learning and deep learning for the most part. And I find it interesting that this idea of folk knowledge and folklore has seeped into the industry. This is a quite widely shared article by Pedro Domingos in the early days of deep learning. And the main point he was making is that this is not scientific. We are approaching machine learning through folk knowledge, through folklore, through stories and hearsay. And this is what we need to be looking into, because people need to tap into some kind of folk knowledge to advance machine learning. There is folklore about sorting algorithms, a great paper highlighting how a lot of research around sorting algorithms is built through results that can be thought of as folk theorems, not demonstrated, or nobody knows who demonstrated them, but they're taken as proved. And William Woodridge wrote about how stuff like the stories about Eliza function as a sort of folklore of AI, so circulating in the AI industry, and with echoes of things that we also see circulating today. So there were stories about Eliza convincing or encouraging students to commit suicide that we see echoed in today's discussion about chatbots. And I'll conclude with one particular example of machine learning folklore that you might have heard about. So there is a story about the US Army, or DARPA, developing a neural network to identify camouflaged tanks. And the story says that researchers trained a neural net on photos of tanks in trees and photos of trees without tanks, and then they ran the model and they discovered that the model was working, but actually it was not identifying tanks or trees or not, but it was identifying photos with sunny weather or not. So it had learned the wrong thing. The interesting thing about this story, it exists in a million different versions. It's DARPA, it's the US, it's the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s today, is that it never happened. It's simply an urban legend that researcher Gwen Brownwen has tracked to a question at an AI conference where a professor said that they heard about it, but nobody can find when it actually happened or if there is any grounding in history. So I think this exemplifies how folklore, folk narratives, craft are still very much important in whatever we imagine is today's algorithms and algorithmic systems. And at the same time, I think there is a lot of folk practices developing around machines, data centers. This is from Taiwan, where this kind of chips or snack called guai guai are still put on machines to bless them and make them function, because engineers and tech workers believe that they can bewitch wayward tech and possess magical powers. So we're still very much in line with millennia of history where folk, craft, and technology were connected. So to wrap up, I'll just summarize some takeaways. I think that what we have seen in the past couple of decades has been a rediscovery of algorithms as cultural objects, maybe because there has been a systemic turn or a scalar shift. But on the other hand, the recognition that there's a lot of folklore around algorithms suggests that older forms of knowledge production are re-emerging alongside new technologies. If we look at the history of mathematics, modeling and prediction, calculation are all linked to millennia-old epistemic objects, so folk crafts, beliefs, rituals, and narratives. And in conclusion, I think that folklore persists and continues to support knowledge work in the history of science, math, computer science, and today with artificial intelligence. And thanks.
Thank you, Gabriele. So, Alexandra Deem is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow in our Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage here at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. She works between the fields of digital anthropology and feminist cultural studies, and her current project investigates the impact of generative AI on the creator economy through ethnographic research among those creating and deploying AI influencers, models, and characters on social media. And she has a book forthcoming with Routledge titled The Tradwife Revolution, an ethnography of trad futurism on social media, which sounds promising and creepy at the same time. So I leave the floor to Alexandra, who is going talk titled Automaga, LLMs as anti-woke meme machines. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, alongside the project on AI influencers, that's the basis of my postdoc fellowship, as Bernardo mentioned. I've been spending some time over the past few months in digital spaces populated by and kind of algorithmically centered on the American far right, which in the age of Trump is often encapsulated by the MAGA acronym, short of course for Make America Great Again. This presentation zeroes in on how this project of making America great again is increasingly being enacted through the production and circulation of AI-generated content on social media, with a focus on content that I came across on X. While the findings presented here are not the outcome of a full-fledged ethnography, given that they're based on a pretty short stint in the field, they do reflect an ethnographic approach that excavates some of the everyday media practices of MAGA adherents and engages with this cultural production directly in order to consider how the evident authoritarian turn that's referred to indeed under a range of headings is not only a reflection of macro political and economic forces and the interests of powerful actors, but is also interpreted, experienced, and kind of co-produced at the popular level. So, if I can figure out how to switch the slide. In the first part of the presentation, I'm going to give a very brief overview of the trajectory of MAGA digital culture and situate it in a broader post-truth context. And I'm going to start by tossing us right into the issue at hand. So for those of you who've been following US politics closely in the year since Trump took office for his second term as president, there's a good chance that you've seen at least one of these images, all of which are AI generated and all of which were posted to the White House and Trump's own profiles on X and Truth Social, illustrating how the administration, and as we're going to be seeing shortly, the wider MAGA movement has wholeheartedly embraced AI as a tool in the culture wars against wokeness. This perhaps comes as little surprise 10 years after Trump's first electoral victory, when the term alt-right became a household name around the country for the mostly online movement that had allegedly clinched Trump the presidency through what they themselves referred to as meme warfare. Because memes had formerly been associated with a more liberal political agenda, scholars had their work cut out for them, showing how the affordances and practices of participatory media could just as well be used for contravening woke or politically correct tenets and normalizing racism and misogyny. The atmospheric rise of anti-woke meme culture online fed into the perception that we'd entered a post-truth era. So widespread was this sentiment that the Oxford English Dictionary designated post-truth as the 2016 word of the year, offering a widely cited definition that highlighted how objective facts had seemingly become less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. 10 years after the post-truth Big Bang, it's becoming increasingly clear that, as Jacqueline Fent puts it, truth is no longer a benchmark but a vibe. Describing how the relentless attention economy shaping digital spaces has eroded democracy into spectacle, contradiction, or meme, she coins the term neo-orality to denote a new epistemic framework that privileges immediacy over reflection, presence over argument, and shared emotional resonance over detached verification. In a recent Substack post that explores how AI itself feeds into an emergent neo-orality, political scientist Henry Farrell reflects on how LLMs, in a manner similar to earlier oral traditions, reproduce narrative tropes and themes not in the same form time and time again, but with a degree of difference and variation. The difference between primary orality and LLMs, he explains, is that the former depended on human-to-human transmission, while the latter condense and actualize the oral tradition itself without a human speaker. Combining these perspectives, both LLMs and an attention economy honed for and by social media facilitate the shift to neo-orality, a shift that the MAGA movement has been capitalizing on for some time now. So with this context in place, I can get into part 2 of the presentation, where we're going to engage more with some anti-woke AI content in order to better understand some of the discursive, affective, and participatory dimensions of emerging neo-oral culture and politics. So to start with, these are some sequential stills from an AI-generated video uploaded to X with the caption, "If only we had somebody like Trump." The video presents a fictional scenario comprised by some minimal dialogue and some music in the form of a backing track, which of course we can't hear in this format, but take my word for it. And then imagery depicting Trump bursting into Keir Starmer's office and commanding him to stop compromising the British homeland. As is clear from just a handful of the lengthy chain of comments on the post, most users aren't fooled into thinking that this actually happened, but are nonetheless engaging because the video has made them feel something. So there's a few comments reflecting disgust at the video's valorization of Trump, but there are many more expressing a sense of glee and an intense yearning for the AI fantasy to be reality, including a comment that echoes the post caption saying, "If only this could actually happen to Keir Starmer." The sentiment, if only here, has a temporal dimension that I think is worth underlining, reflecting the desire for an alternate present. This imaginary present is not singular or set in stone, but potentially manifold, as these stills from another iteration of the video posted in the comments of the original demonstrate. The remixed version retains the same general narrative arc, but introduces a new theme, making Trump into Captain America and swapping out the music from the pre-existing video for a superhero anthem. Despite being different from the static text and image-based examples that we might associate with the term, we can see these videos as an internet meme, given that they share common characteristics of content, form, and stance, were created with awareness of each other, and were circulated, imitated, or transformed via the internet by many users, giving them a participatory dimension that pushes us away from top-down understandings of media influence. In this sense, memes like these feed into another participatory media practice often referred to as fandom, in which a given public figure's persona becomes a collectively created construct forged through the feedback loop between celebrity, media, and public. Framing the MAGA movement's continued appeal in terms of fandom helps explain why increasingly it seems that facts are not things that are verifiably true or false, but merely components in a story. Trump is not the only character that the MAGA fandom spins stories around, however, as the X-post pictures on the left attests to. Coming from an account dedicated to the production of so-called Fat Vance video memes, this particular post invites followers to share whether they think these memes hurt Vance's image. The commenters variously express their amusement and argue such memes ultimately make him more relatable, a function Vance himself evidently recognizes, as one of the commenters highlights in sharing a news story of him dressed up as his meme for Halloween last year. Vance become meme exemplifies the feedback loop between fans and the object of their fandom, which might be a real person, but which is nonetheless rendered as a character in what we could think of as a neo-oral story taking shape between fans, celebrity-come characters, AI tools, and social media affordances. So, in the final part of the presentation, I'm going to explore the temporal aspect of these mimetic fandoms further by looking at one last example from X. This is a still from a video featuring Trump strolling down a street in Greenland, wearing the Nike sweatsuit that Venezuelan President Maduro was wearing when he was abducted by the US military last month. It's a meme that aestheticizes the imperialistic activity of the Trump administration in Venezuela, as well as the prospective imperial land grab in Greenland, providing a mashup of present political events that suggests Trump is carrying this all out with an unmistakable Trump vibe that, for one of the commenters below, makes him, quote, the funniest character that ever lived, whether it's AI or real. Another comment on the same post consists of an AI image of Trump as a Viking chieftain, presumably on his way to take over Greenland. Drawing on the history of Viking conquest, the image depicts a hypothetical future that looks a lot like an imagined past. The original video meme is, in turn, a compendium of a thick political present that's suspended just on the edge of realization, yet not quite here, the present in the perspective tense of anticipation. I want to consider how the temporal constructs reflected in the content of these memes share affinities with the structural affordances of memes and LLMs more broadly. Starting with memes, Lamore Schiffman describes the temporality of memes as being inherently oriented to the future as they are designed to elicit further versions. At the same time, they are based on acknowledgement of versions created in the past, making them perspective in nature, that is anticipating a future behavior based on past promises. And as such, I would add they may be particularly effective at making a desired future feel present. The AI memes we've been looking at are not only instances of this sort of mimetic cultural production, but also examples of what Roland Meyer describes as platform realism, a second-order aesthetic of generic images optimized to match textual descriptions, consumer expectations, and ultimately images that already exist. Explicating the temporality of platform realism, Meyer points out AI image synthesis has to rely on interpolating data from the past to produce an image of the present or even the future. For this reason, he argues platform realism is structurally conservative, even nostalgic, and further facilitates the dissolution of histories into a series of aesthetic vibes. The structural nostalgia of LLMs combined with the perspective orientation of internet memes are perhaps so readily instrumentalized by MAGA, given how the slogan and the movement that's assembled behind it reflects the affective temporal orientation of a fascist politics that, in a widely cited definition, Roger Griffin identifies as a form of palingenetic ultranationalism, which stages the mythic rebirth of a lost past in order to achieve an alternate modernity. Combining this eye to palingenesis with an understanding of fascism as a response to a crisis of capital accumulation, Alberto Toscano highlights how fascism's utopian apocalyptic perceptions of time screen out fascism's subordination to the capitalist temporalities whose contradictions it strives to escape. This emphasis on fascism's endeavor to screen out its own entanglement with capitalist temporality is integrally related to fascism's mediation in a given time and place, a point that Walter Benjamin famously brought home in his work of art essay when he explains how fascism grants the proletarianized masses a form of expression devoid of rights. This leads invariably to the aestheticizing of politics, and aesthetics that Benjamin argued was closely tied to the new media of the interwar period, namely film. One of the key new media of our time, on the other hand, is, to quote Willem Flusser, another very prescient 20th century media theorist, the technical image, or an image rendered through computational processes rather than the visual capabilities of humans or even cameras. Explaining how technical images are blindly assembled from particles of possibility, Flusser connects this technological change with a larger shift in consciousness, the basis of which he argues is the calculation of probability. Under this subjective paradigm, the concepts of true and false refer only to unattainable horizons of certainty, he writes. This offers a way of situating post-truth politics as endemic to a universe of technical images, one in which, to repeat Meyer's point, history dissolves into a series of aesthetic vibes. The point of drawing out these temporal affinities between fascism, AI, and memes is not just to show how the fascism of our times makes use of AI memes, but to think about how AI creates conditions that fascism can exploit. So to finish up this presentation, I'm going to suggest that the exploitable nature of AI by fascism might relate not only to the ways that AI is inherently palingenetic, that is drawing on past to imagine presents or futures, but also mimetic, so relating to how AI functions as a kind of meme machine. Oh, shoot, wait. So yeah, interestingly, before it was kind of taken up in online vernacular to refer to the sort of participatory, replicable digital content that I defined earlier, the term meme was coined by biologist Richard Dawkins to refer to discrete units of cultural transmission. For Dawkins, memes, though they are wide-ranging enough to encompass tunes, fashions, or ways of making pots, are analogous to genes in the way that they hop from brain to brain in a competitive manner and replicate through the process of imitation. While we might question the one-to-one comparison of gene and meme for addressing the non-deterministic process of cultural transmission, this conceptualization of memes can, I think, be useful in considering how AI is replicating not human intelligence per se, but rather this sort of imitative capacity. or, as a number of scholars have written, how AI works as a cultural technology that is a means of modeling and organizing culture that also provides a new vantage on culture. To make a similar point in terms of vibe, a term that's surfaced a lot in this presentation, AI both reproduces and illustrates something about the nature of vibes, a capacity that Pelle Greitzer recognizes in explaining how autoencoders approximate our own ability as neural netty creatures to distill a vibe from a set of worldly phenomena in a manner that reveals how a vibe is an abstractum that cannot be separated from its concreta. So to tie things up here and conclude, I think AI memes, on the other hand, could be understood as concreta that can't be separated from their abstracta, or the vibes that they recombine and transmit. The I to AI memes in this presentation supports a framing of the post-truth phenomenon not as a problem of disinformation alone, but of desire manifested through affective temporal practices that enact prospective presence. MAGA exemplifies this as a fascistic fandom endemic to neo-oral society, which has weaponized AI's function as a meme machine in its quest to offer intensified affective expression without structural change. Framing AI as a meme machine in this context underscores how fascism is fueled by a palingenetic memetics that LLMs are structurally suited to augment, a tendency that I think also begs the question of what a memetics of resistance, as well as a scholarly methodology for post-truth neo-oral times might look like. Yeah, so I'm going to wrap up here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Alexandra.